acknowledge that the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. I acknowledge that the country we all meet on, whether virtually or physically, was never ceded and it always was and always will be an Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to traditional owners of the country and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, their culture, their connection to country, and their ancestors, and elders past, present, and emerging. I also pay my respects to any Aboriginal peoples who may be attending today's event. This webinar has been put together by the Faith Communities Council of Victoria in partnership with City of Melbourne, Religions of Peace Australia, Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Welcome again to today's session on faith communities supporting healthy family relationships. I'm Monisha Sandhu from Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and I'll be moderating the session today. Today's session very aptly coincides with the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women that marks the beginning of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence across the globe. It also has a greater significance now, since after the outbreak of COVID-19, emerging data and reports from those on the front lines have shown that all types of family violence and like violence against women and girls, particularly domestic violence, has intensified. This is like a shadow pandemic growing amidst the COVID-19 crisis that needs urgent prioritization. I would therefore also like to acknowledge that talking about family violence can have an impact whether or not you have had an experience. So if you feel you are getting impacted by the discussion, just feel free to take a break or do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, because that is of prime importance. And you may call 1800 RESPECT on 1800 737 732. They provide support to people affected by domestic and family violence. And so now, before we go any further, some housekeeping stuff. So we are recording the webinar and we will be uploading it on the FCCV YouTube channel. Everyone who has registered will be advised of the link. People in the audience will be muted during the webinar, and but we do have a question and answer session that hopefully we will have it from 3:15 to 3:30 p.m. if everything goes by the planned timelines. And how to ask the question. So at any time during the webinar, you can request from the host, Sandy, who is silently sitting behind doing all the back end work, to ask a question at the end of the webinar to any panelist. And then at about 3:15 p.m., after all the panelists have spoken, we will unmute the person who will be asking the question so that they can ask their question. And please note, when asking a question, remember to unmute yourself, state who you are, who the question is directed to, and keep it as brief as possible. So thank you once again. And before I invite the panelists, I will begin by sharing a brief background of the project. So the Faith Communities Supporting Healthy Family Relationships is an action research project established by the Multi-Faith Advisory Group, known as MAG, based on the recommendations 163 and 165 of the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence. The recommendations highlighted the important role faith-based communities and organizations can actually play in the lives of Victorians affected by family violence. The project is funded by Multicultural Affairs within the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and it is being implemented in partnership between University of Melbourne and Multicultural Centre for Women's Health. The project involves two phases. So in the first phase, University of Melbourne conducted an in-depth review of the existing evidence and also held consultations with stakeholders and leaders from different religious communities. And so this resulted in the development of a technical paper and an evidence guide that further provides evidence about best, promising, and some of the emerging practices across the globe to build the capacity of faith-based organizations, faith communities, and specifically faith leaders to effectively prevent and respond to family violence and violence against women. In the second phase, the Multi-Faith Advisory Group, they nominated 5 faith communities to be supported to develop, implement, and evaluate a leadership capacity building initiative. And this 18-month phase of the project will generate evidence about what works and what does not work to build capacity of faith leaders to respond to and prevent violence against women and family violence. So the 5 faith communities working on the project include Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, Uniting Church, Buddhist community, Sikh community, and Hindu community. All right, enough of me talking. So now I would like to welcome our lovely panelists who will be sharing more about the project and the challenges and successes in building the prevention and response capacity of faith leaders and their communities. We have Cathy Vaughan from the University of Melbourne, Krishnan from Kulturbrille and Faith Communities Council of Victoria, Robyn Andréo-Boosey from Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, and Jessica Wilson from Buddhist Council of Victoria. So first of all, let me invite Cathy. Cathy Vaughan is an associate professor in gender and women's health at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. She currently leads a number of research projects on violence against women with a focus on violence against migrant and refugee women, women in faith communities, and women in the Pacific region. Cathy previously led the Andrews-funded Muses project on the role of the settlement and multicultural sector in supporting women experiencing violence, and also Andrews-funded Aspire project on the dynamics of violence against migrant and refugee women. She also co-leads the NOVA data program of training and mentoring to build capacity to conduct rigorous, safe, and ethical research on violence against women in Asia and the Pacific. So welcome, Cathy. And to begin with, my first question to you is, why do we need to address violence against women and family violence within faith settings? And what is it that makes faith settings different from any other environment?
Thank you very much, Monisha. Just check that you can hear me. So Monisha, maybe if you give me a big, that's great. I'm never quite sure with these headphones if they're working. It's fantastic to see so many people here, and thank you very much for inviting me, Sandhu and FCCB, to speak today. And before I respond to your question, Monisha, I would also like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and to acknowledge leaders past and present and any Indigenous people on the call today. You asked about why it's important to develop prevention and responses to violence against women in faith settings, and why is it different to any other setting? By way of responding to that question, I thought I might share some slides. Sandy asked if I would just share a couple of slides, and I'll try not to be too long-winded about them, but sharing what we learned from that evidence review that you mentioned, where we really looked at what's been published about responding to violence against women and preventing violence against women in faith settings, and particularly what we know about building the capacity of faith leaders, and use that as a way of talking about what's specific to faith settings. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I'm hoping, again, Monisha, are you able to see that?
Yep.
Great,
yep.
Fantastic. All right. So just moving to the next slide. So one of the reasons it's important that there is a focus on faith settings, and in particular on working with faith leaders, is that we know that there are features of faith settings which can both be incredibly protective of women and a really important resource for women who are experiencing violence, but which may also contribute to women's experiences of violence and family violence against women who are women of faith. When we looked at the literature and tried to both, we had 3 questions from the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and one was to look at causes and contributing factors, and then the other 2 questions were around the evidence in relationship to prevention and response of violence against women. The biggest cluster of evidence that we found was really in relation to causes and contributing factors. And so there's a number of reasons that faith settings and relationships in faith contexts may contribute to violence against women. And the first one I'd like to really acknowledge is that there's been a failure historically to engage with faith leaders and faith communities by the violence specialist services, the violence response sector, and by policymakers and decision makers seeking to try and prevent and respond to violence against women. And in part, that's come about because of beliefs that faith leaders and faith communities may be conservative or hold views that can be seen as sort of part of the problem in relation to violence against women. But having that view actually becomes a reinforcing and sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're not engaging with faith leaders and communities of faith, then it becomes impossible to understand where they're at and to understand women's experiences and be able to respond in those contexts. So that's the first thing I would say. The second area of literature where it was evident that there might be contributing factors in faith settings is the ways that sometimes faith settings, scripture or language can be interpreted as supporting gender inequality or supporting the use of violence against women as perhaps a form of discipline or in relation to things like male headship of a family. And so this is by no means universal across faiths, and it's definitely not universal within a faith tradition. So if I've learnt nothing else over the last couple of years of working with Victoria's very diverse faith communities, is the incredible diversity within any faith tradition. So ranging from quite traditional views in relation to how people view the position and role of men and women in the community, through to very progressive positions, which is not to say that that actually always comes with a deep understanding of drivers of violence against women, I might say. But that is something to highlight, that faith teachings in scripture and sacred texts can be interpreted in particular ways that can be violence supportive. There are also challenges with structured gender inequality in many faith traditions, and certainly the faith tradition I grew up in is one where there were very specific roles for men and women within the faith setting, and the leadership roles in the community were solely reserved for men in that tradition, and that is similar in many other faith traditions. And when you have a setting of structured gender inequality like that, it can be particularly difficult to try and work towards the prevention of violence against women when we know that one of the underpinning factors driving violence against women is the inequality of men and women. Other causes and contributing factors include barriers to divorce in many faith traditions, not all, but in very many. And in some traditions, even when divorce is allowed, only men can request a divorce. And that creates a lot of difficulty for women who may be living with violence in that relationship and who would seek to leave that relationship if they could. There is a culture in many faith traditions of denying that family violence is an issue for them. And I think this is, there's a famous Canadian violence theologist who specialises in research around violence against women in faith traditions, and she calls it the holy hush, a sort of denial that it's a problem for that community, but also a complete resistance to talking about violence. And that was something that was well documented in the literature across many different faith traditions, including, it should be said, both Christian and non-Christian traditions, the sort of non-Abrahamic traditions, as well as the sort of major Abrahamic faiths, and that was a sort of universal challenge around denial and silence. But there are perhaps particular additional barriers to speaking up about violence within faith traditions for communities of faith who also are migrant or refugee background communities, because they're also experiencing racism in the host community often. And so there's a kind of a desire to put a good foot forward and not to give any ammunition to the racists, but that can then silence women in those communities. And that leads nicely into the last point that was very evident in the literature about the intersection of culture and experiences of migration for the very many diverse faith traditions in Victoria, which is such a multicultural state, and also is a state that has very high levels of people of faith. And so this is a really central issue for our state, and it's great to see so many people on the call. When it came to the next two questions that the department asked us to respond to, which was looking at what evidence there was about building faith leaders' capacity to prevent violence against women or respond, we found far less evidence than in the first response to the first question. The evidence about response-focused projects was there in that there were many toolkits and resource guides and facilitators manuals and so on for building the capacity of faith leaders to respond to violence. So if a woman was to disclose violence or someone was disclosing family violence, that they would know how to respond, to refer, to connect in with services. But there was very little by way of evaluation of these responses to know how effective they were in building the capacity of faith leaders. But one of the key messages that came out from this section of the literature review was a real need to build bridges and two-way learning between faith settings and faith leaders and the specialist violence sector. So a lot of times violence specialists might ask of a faith leader, is it safe for a woman to disclose that she's experiencing violence in this faith setting, or to you as a faith leader? But equally, we should be asking that if a woman is going to a violence specialist service, is it safe for her to disclose that she's a woman of faith? Because there's often not an understanding of the importance of faith in women's lives, the central role it plays in women's identity, and how that it needs to be included in response and supporting that woman. So it's a two-way thing, lots of learning going both directions. Far less, so there was limited evidence about response and even less around prevention. And I think this is partly because overall there's less evidence about effective approaches to preventing violence against women. And it's hard. This is really hard. If you think back to those causes and contributing factors, that's what needs to change in order to prevent violence. We know that the driving factors in relation to violence against women include sort of violence against women being sort of normalised, and supportive attitudes around men having a kind of higher status in the community, and changing those sorts of attitudes is very difficult. What there was in terms of evidence around prevention really actually comes from Victoria. So I think that there'll be people on the line who've been involved in two of the only evaluated prevention interventions that have been run that we found in our literature review. And one of those was the Northern Respectful Relationships, Interfaith Relationships Program, and then the second was the Challenge Project. So those two projects are really amongst the few internationally of prevention-focused work in faith settings. And they spoke to the importance of kind of co-design and the importance of violence specialists working with faith communities and faith leaders, so that people of faith are leading those interventions, using the language that will be understood by that community and accepted, and starting from that point, rather than as outsiders to a faith tradition coming in with a particular way of speaking about violence against women or gender inequality, which may cause the door to not even be open in the first place. One of the other key lessons out of that work in relation to prevention did also speak to the challenges around interfaith approaches to prevention. Now, I would say from the work we've done so far with the very diverse faith communities in those 5 pilot projects, is that even within a faith tradition, there's incredible diversity. So, for example, I know Robyn will be speaking on behalf of the Anglican Diocese in a moment, but to be a member of the Anglican community in Melbourne is not to be one thing. And it's difficult enough to get people in different parts of the Anglican Diocese on the same page about prevention of violence against women, let alone trying to do that across faith traditions with very different language and understandings and kind of starting points in relation to gender and its role in violence against women. So I think there are lots of strengths of interfaith approaches for perhaps awareness raising and so on, but for the kind of deep reflection that's needed around gender and the role of men and women and non-binary community members for different faith traditions, that's probably something that's easier to do intra rather than interfaith. I won't speak to this in any detail, but I did really want to highlight that there is, of the literature that we looked at from around the world, there is very little from outside the Christian, Muslim and Jewish communities. There's just minimal research has been published in other communities and even in some of the Christian, the Orthodox or Restorationist Christian communities. That's partly a language bias in the publishing literature, a publication of literature, but I think also there's been very little funding given to this kind of work in other faith traditions. And so I'm grateful that the Multi-Faith Advisory Council advised the department to really fund this work in rapidly growing faith traditions in Victoria. These other areas where we don't know very much about how to best support religious men who use violence to change their behaviour, how to address other forms of family violence, and about how to build capacity in a robust way. But I want to finish, and I'm determined not to go over my time, Sandy. I can see you at the bottom of the screen there, just to highlight the key principles that we identified out of that literature review. And as Monisha said, that technical paper and evidence guide are both available and will be made available to anyone who's interested after the workshop. But the key principles we do want to highlight are around prioritising women's safety and children's safety as the first priority in the design of any prevention or response intervention. That there is a real need to strengthen relationships between secular organisations and faith leaders, and that needs to be a two-way ongoing relationship. That these sorts of interventions will not work if they are designed and developed by people outside the faith community, that there really needs to be leadership and opportunities for community leaders within faith traditions to play that role. The central role of gender inequality, even if the language that you use might be slightly different to be able to engage with different faith traditions, the international evidence is very clear on the central role of gender inequality in violence against women, and so that can't be ignored. However, not all women experience violence in the same way, and so when I say recognising intersectionality, it's recognising that women from different migrant and refugee backgrounds or of different migration status or with disability or living in rural areas, there'll be a whole lot of other important aspects of women's lives that shape their experience of violence, not just their gender. The sixth principle is talking about different mechanisms will suit different contexts. So in some faith traditions, and we've seen this, oh my goodness, we've seen this year with COVID-19, some faith communities are very tech savvy. You can, I know Anu will be speaking in a little while about the work that she's been doing with communities where she can do a lot of work online, and that context is appropriate. That modality is appropriate, but it won't work for many other faith traditions where that would exclude a large proportion of the congregation or the faith community. So it's really about knowing your community and developing the best approach for them. But in all of the literature, it was very clear that if senior leadership within a faith tradition are resistant to the intervention or are not engaged from early on, that undermines the likelihood of success of the intervention. And finally, the last principle is really a plea to build in evaluation of the response right from the start. Anything that you do in faith traditions, to try and document what worked and why, and also what didn't work, because the evidence base is so thin. It would make all of our lives much easier if we're able to learn from each other and build on what's been done before. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen there. Sorry, Sandy's saying it might be my hair over my hair over the microphone. I hope you could hear me okay there. I've just seen the chat there. But that's by way of speaking to your Christian, Monisha, about why work in faith communities and why they're different. And I think the primary reason is why work in them is because it's a really important part of many people's lives. And if we're ignoring this central part of people's lives, it's such a lost opportunity. And there are many features of faith communities where we do want to try and bring about change to not to not contribute to any violence that women may be experiencing. Long-winded answer to a short question, Monisha.
No, thank you so much, Cathy. That was really a very detailed description of why we actually need to work more aggressively within the faith settings and with faith communities. So thank you so much for that detailed explanation. Just to let everyone know that Cathy has written a detailed academic report and much shorter versions in the form of an evidence guide and tip sheet that outlines an entire list of principles and recommendations for providers who are working with faith communities. So these documents can be downloaded from the MCWH website or from the University of Melbourne website as well. But we will also be sending it out to all the workshop registrants. So today we have simply touched on a very few important points of this report, but the detailed report would be sent to you all for your future reference. So thank you, Cathy, once again. We now move on to our next panel.
Monisha, I think you've muted yourself accidentally.
Oops, was it just now or did I just speak? Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah. So Anu has a background in social anthropology, social work, and applied psychology. She has more than 25 years experience of working within multicultural communities in 5 different countries and has worked in training, family violence, and community education. Anu was also awarded the 2019 Community Innovation Award by Victorian Multicultural Commission for her Prevention of Family Violence Leadership Program for multicultural communities. So welcome, Anu. And first of all, I guess it's really important to know that why was the Hindu community selected to be a part of this project?
Yep. Thank you, Monisha, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Namaste. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on traditional unceded lands. And also as a migrant, as a first-generation migrant, acknowledge the wealth of spirit and welcome that the indigenous people have had for thousands of years for everyone who's come here and has been allowed to build a life which hopefully will continue to flourish and be safe and respectful in all possible aspects. So I'd like to start with that. And Monisha, thank you for the question around why the Hindu community was selected to be part of this project. A couple of reasons clearly warranted the involvement of the Hindu community in this project. One is that even in the last probably 10 years, the Hindu religion is probably one of the fastest growing religions in Victoria. And migrants from the countries where Hinduism is common, including India, Sri Lanka, Fiji, Singapore, Malaysia, are among the top migrants contributing to the Victorian migration intake, which makes it quite important that we look at this community more closely and ensure that they are coming on board with the primary prevention of violence activity. The other reason why the Hindu community also formed part of this project is because outside of the mainstream community, women from mainstream communities reaching out for support for family violence, it's women who nominate India as their birth country, who are the second most common callers to all the lines where women reach out for support. So it made it critical for us to have this project within the Hindu community, and also understanding that with any religious community, when it is visibly different, it makes it easy for that community, like Cathy said earlier, to become targets of discrimination or labeling as violent communities. And it makes sense to engage with the communities to bring them into the conversation.
So then, like after you decided that Hindu community is really important to be a part of this project, so which Hindu organizations did you select to participate, and why was that selection done?
Yeah. About 2.3% of Victoria's population is Hindu, which is around 160,000 people. And like most other religions, and particularly for religions which don't have a very structured or hierarchical nature, the Hindu community is quite wide. There are between 25 and 30 places of worship where Hindus choose to go. And doing the initial scoping for the project, it became evident that some of the more entrenched traditional Hindu congregations, I'd like to call it, it would be difficult to make the outreach to get into them and talk about this very intransigent issue. So the decision was made to approach the more progressive congregations, congregations where the practitioners were generally younger, professional, also had been here for lesser time, and were open to discussing this in an open manner, and had, I guess, the vision to understand why this work was important, and trying to, hating to use this description, but trying to get the low-hanging fruit so we could prove that it can be done, and then use the learnings to move to the more traditional and hierarchical and more intransigent congregations. So we decided to work with ISKCON, and we decided to work with the Global Organization of Divinity, which are two congregations with a large number of young practitioners, and also congregations which have established network of temples and centers, where we found it would be more easy to reach the congregants and take our message and work with them to figure out what works for them. And yeah, so we chose those two. There are about 27 ISKCON centers across the greater Melbourne area, and about 5 Global Organization of Divinity centers across Melbourne, which we were able to work with.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So what was the approach? Like, how did you get them involved, and who did you need to have on board so that, like, the project could be implemented?
Like any community project, it becomes important to make sure that you're reaching the right people within the organizations who not only are going to support your message, but also champion it within the organization. And like many other things, it was easy to work with the connections that we currently had. So with ISKCON, we were very lucky to have some high-ranked champions within the organization who were willing to champion our cause within the temples. We set up a focus group with women who are already actively working with congregants in looking at women's leadership, empowerment, and safety. And that enabled us to work with those women to develop programs that would suit them and consult with them. With the Global Organization of Divinity, we used personal connections to make the initial outreach. They too have an existing group of women who meet regularly to discuss leadership and community issues. And while family violence is never openly discussed, terms like family conflict, having better relationships, having happy families, and strength-based relationships were common themes that were coming through. And we use those as hooks to get the discussion further into talking about primary prevention, because a lot of primary prevention is about looking at the long-term view and developing the strength-based relationships, which will enable us to get to a safer family. And like Cathy said, it is universally recognized that gender inequality is the reason why violence against women continues to not just happen, but amplify and sustain. So one of the hooks that we used with both these organizations is that we're going to be talking about respectful relationships and equality. And it becomes very difficult then for a progressive congregation to say, we actually don't want to talk about gender equality. We don't want to touch that at all. So that made it easier for us to have those discussions and make that reaching out point.
So I know, I mean, like you have also earlier talked about the workshops that you run with the group. So can you tell us more about these workshops?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Cathy said, we were initially planning all of this in a non-COVID world. But then, of course, COVID had happened and we all had to pivot to figure out what we can do next. And we had gotten to a point with both the organizations, ISKCON as well as GOD, where they were both very keen on doing something. And we had initially planned a series of focus groups and sessions with women and with men and with faith leaders and mixed gender groups as well. While we went back to them to say that, I'm sorry, we don't know when we can come back and do stuff, GOD, the Global Organization of Divinity, had already moved to Zoom platform to do their spiritual classes. And some of the younger people actually suggested, why don't we try doing these sessions over Zoom? We had planned a whole heap of activities around respectful relationships, bystander training, looking at leadership, looking at informing the congregation about what the Change the Story model actually looks like. So we went back to the drawing board, created some of the materials to be delivered over Zoom. And then over the course of 4 months, we delivered between the two congregations 13 sessions over Zoom. And these sessions were developed completely in consultation with both the communities. And we had groups of women, groups of men, mixed groups, faith leaders, spiritual teachers. This is teachers who teach the children Hindu scriptures and also Indian languages. We also had some youth leaders who came on board and said that they were finding that the pandemic was seriously impacting their mental health. And they asked if the project could talk about mental health in these communities, because again, that's another topic that's not very easily discussed. So because it was a need from the community and from the youth, we decided to address that as well. But through all of the sessions, we weaved respectful relationships and equality through all the sessions to make sure that that messaging stayed consistent. And we did with each congregation about six sessions in one and 7 in the other, with groups of just women, groups of just men, 2 youth groups, 8 to 13-year-olds, and then 13 to 18-year-olds, and 1 joint session with teachers and what we call community leaders. Again, Hinduism is not a tradition where there is a religious leader to who people go to when they've got difficulties. They normally reach out to community leaders within the temples. These are volunteers who run classes and manage the community in a sense. And we invited all of these people to come together for sessions to discuss the problems that they saw in implementing some of these things and creating awareness around family violence. One of the other things that we found with both these congregations is that while there was a very definite recognition of what violence actually is when we talk about physical violence and sexual violence and the more gross forms of violence, there is very little understanding about what I'd like to, just for the purposes of this session, call the softer forms of violence, which are not easily seen or don't leave physical or visible scars. These are emotional violence, psychological violence, cyber violence, and controlling behavior. And when we started talking about these, there was a growing realization that the problem is much more entrenched, and got them to think about these things a little bit more and urge them to do action and create solutions from within both these groups which would work for them. Because again, coming from outside, it becomes very difficult for someone to dictate and tell them what best practice actually is. They need to come up with the best practice themselves. So some of the sessions were just discussions around these concepts as well.
I guess that's really a handful because understanding the community's need, also understanding what their priority is for the time. So, and adjusting it within the project, that's, I guess it really requires a lot of, flexibility and courage to do that. So thanks for sharing that with us. So I'm sure, throughout the way, there must have been challenges that you encountered, especially while running the workshop. So definitely, shifting to Zoom must have been a big task. But what some other challenges were there that you would like to share?
I think one of the greatest challenges is the loss of the personal connection and touch, and being able to leverage off the reactions you're getting from people when you do anything in person. So even just running the focus groups over Zoom was challenging, because we were trying to get a sense of what people are really thinking, and they'd go off camera and you don't know whether they're rolling their eyes or actually championing you on. So that was a bit of a challenge. The other challenge was developing content which would resonate over Zoom, because there is such a lot of material which we need to work with, but making sure that we're cherry picking the messages that would best suit this platform was a challenge. And it did take a few goes for us to make sure we were getting that right. And the other challenges were probably engaging people for that length of time. Like, because we were doing it over Zoom, we couldn't have all day sessions. So we were breaking it up into 1.5, 2 hours over a number of weeks. And that's a challenge in itself, trying to keep people's interest going for that long. The other challenge we have is language. And I don't mean just the language that we speak, but the language that we use. So being very mindful that particularly over Zoom, you don't come across as disrespectful, blaming, naming and shaming. That was a big challenge for us. And the other challenge, which I think we didn't realize as much going in, is that the diversity of both the groups and the congregants meant that what worked in session 1 may not work in session 8, even though you're delivering almost exactly the same content. You had to change the way you said it. You had to reduce it into more bite-sized pieces. And that, I think, definitely kept us on our toes, which was interesting. And I think the larger challenge, of course, is that it is very easy for people to come to the sessions because they're already 50% on board, but then they're still coming from the, it's not me, I'm just interested. It's not really my problem because it doesn't happen to me or to people that I hold dear. And that, I think, was probably one of the bigger challenges we faced on Zoom, because it's not easy to pick up on that disconnect and address it in an online platform. But yeah, I think we did all right overall.
Yeah, you did, definitely. And so what are, like, some of the successes that you can already see in this project, though it's still a long way to go, but still, like, some of the successes and how you see the future of the project developing?
I think the key success that we found is definitely the engagement of the youth in both the groups, both ISKCON as well as GOD. Knowing that, I say children, but knowing that young people are engaged in the message was really, really very promising, and that gives you hope. And the other, I think the result of that, also running the sessions for young people, was also that some of the messaging really resonated with them around the concepts of respect. And it's a good age and stage in their lives where we can actually intervene to embed some of these messages, because these are the people who are going to become our families and partners and communities of the future. So it becomes easier for us to make sure that we're embedding these messages early. And also being able to unpack some of the tougher issues around respect, gender and equality for young people. Also slots and dovetails nicely with what they're hearing at schools and universities, because that message is definitely being also resonated in their mainstream interactions. So just to get them to understand that their faith interactions will dovetail with their mainstream interactions was a really important win, I think. The other important success was being able to show these communities that we can engage in ways which don't necessarily involve just having long-winded sessions in person, or for them having to do everything in person and trying to engage with people one-on-one. It showed that we can engage effectively over online platform. And I think the overall success was getting them to just talk about some of these more intransigent issues. So that was really good. And as for the second part of your question, what do you think, what do I think the project holds in the future? I think, like Cathy said, it's shown that we have just scratched the surface, and we've kind of whet the appetite of the communities to have longer, deeper, and more meaningful conversations on the issue. It also shows that if we do not engage a large part of what people's lives involve, we are never going to get the success that we want longer term. Whether people are openly willing to talk about their faith, or whether they're openly willing to admit to having issues within their faith traditions, we can't take out the faith from people who are in it. So we need to work with the faith leaders, the community leaders who are part of that faith, to make sure that we can take everybody along the journey of having a safer tomorrow. And Hinduism, like many other religions, is patriarchal in nature. It is a 5,000 plus year old tradition where the systems are definitely heavily loaded towards one gender. And we need to both understand that and work with that to make sure some of those structural issues are addressed. and to enable people to see that encouraging respectful relationships, encouraging gender equality, calling out family violence isn't necessarily challenging a religious faith. It is about making the religion come into the future with us. And I think that message is best both delivered to and delivered by the youth who are going to take that forward, because they're the ones who are going to be carrying it forward. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Anu, so much for sharing your work with us and for all your insights. So now moving on, we have Robyn. So Robyn Andréo-Boosey manages the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne's Preventing Violence Against Women program. Her background is in international development, gender equality, tackling violence against women, and human rights. Robyn is particularly passionate about equipping the church to play its part in ending violence against women. So thank you, Robyn, for joining us today.
Hi.
So Robyn, my first question to you is that the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne has been involved in the prevention and response of family violence and violence against women for quite a few years now. In fact, like long before there was a Royal Commission in Victoria. So why do you think that the Anglican Diocese had made such a strong commitment in this area?
Thank you, Monisha. Before I get onto that question, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm joining on today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge, as a British person, the role of my country in sealing this land and in the violence caused and the resilience of Indigenous people in finding a way forward for all of us. So thank you, Monisha, for that question. So I suppose it's firstly worth saying that we do have a strong mandate in our Christian faith to address this issue. We believe that everyone is made in the image of God and is of equal value, and that we're called to love our neighbour as ourselves. But we haven't, so whilst we haven't always lived up to that calling, there is that rich basis in our faith, in our scripture. And that, as you said, the diocese has been doing prevention work since around 2011. I think one of the key things that sparked this in the beginning was the internal advocacy of Anglicans who understood prevention and were really passionate about seeing change within their faith community. So a name that you'll hear a lot in this when we look at this is Scott Holmes. He's an Anglican priest who did a lot of the trailblazing work initially in this area. And Scott and a group of people within the Anglican Church were able to get this on the agenda of the church many years ago. And they had established relationships with people, and they knew the Anglican structures and processes and how to do that, how to get that on the agenda. And they were able to use their influence and expertise to drive change from within. And the programme started actually being run by an external consultant in 2011, and they had an external review of that, and the diocese realised they wanted to go a lot further and deeper, and to do that they needed an internal role to drive that forward. So that's where my role was started. So I think what this shows is, as others have been sharing today, the importance of this work being led by people from faith communities. Because they can really understand a lot of the nuances and complexities and have that local expertise and ability to influence.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that to us, Robyn. So now the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, you have around 200 churches in Melbourne and Geelong. So what was your selection process for churches that would participate in your pilot project?
So the pilot project that we're doing is part of a wider prevention program that we're running at the diocese. And to recruit churches for that particular pilot project, we advertised it across the diocese to church leaders and parishes, and we invited expressions of interest. We wanted to work with 5 Anglican churches that differed in terms of their size, their location, demographics, and their churchmanship and theological emphasis, so that we could see what worked or didn't work in a variety of settings. And so through the recruitment process, we managed to find a group of 5 Anglican churches that covered that met this criteria. And then we sought to have sign off from their vicar and the parish council, which is effectively the governing board of the local church.
So your project is actually very unique in that you are using a whole of church approach. So can you tell us more about what this whole of church approach is all about?
Yes, so emerging evidence from the prevention sector shows that to shift culture, it's not enough to deliver one-off teaching on a subject or just to put a policy in place, but we really need to be looking at a whole of organisation approach. And this has been trialled in schools, in workplaces and sports clubs, but it hadn't yet, as far as I'm aware, been done in a faith community. And so through our project, we're trying to develop and trial a whole of organisation approach to prevention in a church setting. And it's building upon and adapting existing approaches and resources from the evidence base that exists. So a whole of organisation approach is about securing and embedding change across an organisation, and there are 6 key elements. So I'll talk about it in the context of the church. There's leadership and commitment. So you have clear public commitment in a church setting would be from the clergy and the lay leaders. You look at the teaching and learning spaces in the community. So in a church, that's through the sermons, through the Bible study groups, through the youth and children's groups. And it's about looking at how do we make sure there's teaching in each of these spaces on equality, freedom from stereotypes, respect. A third element is on professional learning. So we've been training staff and volunteers from the different parishes in response and prevention. A fourth element is looking at the culture and environment of the organisation. So assessing that, looking at the policies, procedures and structures and where changes might need to be made there. Then a fifth element is looking at support for staff, volunteers and parishioners in terms of response. So putting in place basic response mechanisms for if there are disclosures, or rather when there are disclosures. And finally, community partnerships, and that's about churches building relationships with their local organisations and working in partnership with them. So it's a real rich, multifaceted approach. And it's involved each church doing a gender assessment to kind of take the temperature of where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then developing an action plan based on their own priorities about where they'd like to go next. And from what we're observing, this approach is leading to quite deep change in the participating churches. And that's been really encouraging.
I'm sure, the whole process would not have been an easy task for the, for especially for you. So what were some of the challenges that you faced or you still are facing in your project?
I think one of the challenges has definitely been around communication and finding the right language. So as Cathy shared, we have a very diverse community, even within the Anglican community, just within Melbourne and Geelong. And the secular language we found doesn't work for our audience. And so we've had to find language that didn't shut down conversations or ring alarm bells, whilst of course not at all diluting the evidence base and the change of story framework, but learning how to almost translate that and communicate that with our faith-based language. And so what we've done on that is we've held workshops with theologians and church leaders from different theological backgrounds to find a common language and work out which words and phrases were jarring with people and what were alternatives that people could agree on. And that's really helped us have strong communication and engage people from different backgrounds. So that's, I guess, an ongoing challenge where you're trying to find the right words to communicate on prevention. Another challenge has probably been building the capacity of clergy. Clergy are really stretched and our time with them in this project has been perhaps more limited than we'd hoped. It's ended up being quite focused on building the capacity of the lay leaders, and they've done a phenomenal job and driven great change in their communities. But I think if we were to do it all again, we would build in more time with the clergy. They've done the training and they're certainly part of the project, but perhaps a few more coaching sessions with them as well. And I think similar to what Anu was saying as well, is just getting people to realise that this is about all of us. And I think this is probably a challenge that's in the wider community as well. But I think people will often project it onto others of, oh, I see what you're saying about those people down the road, or that church down the road, or those people in society. But it's helping people to, I guess, look in the mirror and say, this is all of us. And this is about all of us changing our attitudes and behaviours. So we try to get around that by naming that, I guess, in our training and discussions, and being vulnerable ourselves. So sharing examples for where we've learned things or been on that journey ourselves, and sharing that we're still catching ourselves and noticing in ourselves where we've absorbed certain beliefs or attitudes, and just to help people to each adopt that self-reflective approach to it. So I think that's some of the main challenges.
Yeah, I guess it's like, very relevant what all the challenges they shared, that, that one system cannot fit all. So you have to actually adapt. And then again, same as Anu explained, that there needs to be flexibility and understanding how you can implement whatever within the context of where you are planning to implement the activities or the project. So apart from the challenges, so what are some of the successes that you see in the project, and also, like, how do you see the project developing in future?
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot to celebrate, and the churches and the lay leadership in the churches, they've just done a fantastic job despite all the challenges during COVID. So perhaps a few to highlight is the churches through being involved in the project have become more explicit and public about the message that violence and abuse are never acceptable and can never be justified. They're putting up posters, they're preaching on it, they're including messages in their newsletters. And I think previously there'd been assumptions that, of course, everyone would know that we don't support violence. We don't even need to say it because it's just obvious that doesn't align with our faith. But it definitely didn't go without saying, and churches have realised that since they've started to be more explicit and name this, they've started to have more people open up and share their experiences. So I think that's been a key shift in sending that, churches starting to send that message more clearly. Another thing, success is just conversations are happening in churches, and that can seem small, but actually that's really powerful. Through the gender assessment that the churches have done, through their steering group meetings, through the Bible study groups, through one-on-one conversations, there are conversations happening about this and about culture and about prevention. And what we found is that the real power for change, for culture change, is in the conversations. That's where people's knowledge can be consolidated, where they can get more confident, where their attitudes can shift. It's that kind of, in a conversation, you can tailor what you're saying real time to the person in front of you, and you can really meet them where they're at, and it's relational. And I think seeing more and more conversations happening and the change that that's leading to is a great success in the communities. I think another success is just the power of the coaching and peer learning approach. What we've been learning through the programme is the importance of having a multifaceted approach to capacity building, and not just having training, but having other spaces for reflection and discussion. So we've been delivering coaching, or my colleague has been delivering amazing coaching and peer learning sessions for the lay leaders in the churches. And that's, from the feedback we've had from them, is that's really helped them to unpack this more and work out how to translate it to their faith community, and how to I guess, work out how to navigate some of the complexities in their church and drive it forward. So that's been a real success as well. I think, how do we see it developing in the future? I completely echo what Anu's saying. It's really vital that this work doesn't stop now. We would love to scale this up and take some of the learning. We've been observing the deep change that this can bring about, and we would love to accompany more churches to do this whole of church approach. But this is very much dependent on funding, and there aren't many options available. Although this is a key setting in Change the Story framework, it hasn't had the same attention and funding as other settings. So that's a real struggle. And I think, just as Anu said, we're at a really key point. We're seeing that momentum is starting to build, and we can start to see a shift happening. But we really need to see that these roots being properly established and this being sustained. And I just also echo what Cathy said before to close, that faith runs really deep to people's sense of identity. So when you can really tap into that and harness that potential, the change can go really deep to the core of who they are. And it's a change that can be sustained and can spill out into other sectors. We had a man from one of our pilot churches, after one of our training sessions, he shared with us that he'd then gone on to, he went out for a meal with some other male friends, and he just started conversations about what had happened in the training. And so this can just spill out into other spaces, into people of faith are obviously part of lots of different spaces, in their workplaces, in where they're learning, in where they're doing sports, and in their social settings, and this can spill out as well in a deep way. So it's really important that we look to build on what we've been learning in this space.
Thanks, Robyn. That was really encouraging, and I hope that the momentum continues. So thank you for sharing your project activities with all of us. So now, last but not the least, we have Jessica with us. Jessica Wilson is a social worker and has worked in the family violence sector and community services sector for 5 years. Jessica is the project officer at the Buddhist Council of Victoria for the Faith Communities project, and also she's the project coordinator of the Family Violence Regional Integration Committee in the Eastern Melbourne region. She's passionate about implementing the Victorian Family Violence Royal Commission recommendations to improve the service system for victim survivors and end family violence. So welcome, Jessica.
Thank you.
My first question to you would be that Buddhism in Australia seems to have an international flavor. Like, there are places of worship from Thailand, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, Cambodia, Laos, China, Vietnam, everywhere. So how did you decide which temples and nationalities should participate in your pilot project?
Thank you for the question, Monisha, and for the invitation to speak today. Just before I answer your question, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm working today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, as well as any community members that are here today. Yes, it's an incredibly diverse community, like others have spoken about. And in this pilot project, it just has not been possible to include all the groups that you mentioned. In choosing the pilot temples, the BCV really wanted to represent the 3 Buddhist traditions, Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. So 3 places of worship were chosen that represented these traditions. Quang Minh Temple, which is a Vietnamese temple in Braybrook, Yun Yang Temple, which is a Chinese temple in Narre North, and the Tara Institute, which is a Tibetan temple with a large Western following located in Brighton. These temples also have a close relationship with BCV, so building on these relationships was an entry point for initiating discussions about the project. The temples are also in different areas of Melbourne. Quang Minh is in the Western Metro region, Yun Yang is southeastern, and Tara Institute is in Bayside. So once the temples are linked in with their local family violence networks in each region, they can then build the local knowledge and share that with other temples in the region. Other temples belonging to these traditions were also approached, and the decision to select the temples that we did was also based on the willingness and the capacity of leaders and temple members to take up the project. But we are inviting leaders from other temples we approach to participate in the project in some capacity, like inviting them to our training for faith leaders on preventing and responding to family violence.
And so after you decided on the temples, and what was your strategic approach on how to roll out your project in these places of worships?
So once the temples were confirmed, we really wanted to be clear about the roles, responsibilities, and expectations. So we developed a memorandum of understanding with each temple that they signed. We recruited a key representative from each temple who was a leader of the temple, ordained or lay. We have both on the both representatives. So the representative sits on the project steering committee, and the steering committee is made up of those representatives as well as the BCV executive committee members, our project partners, the University of Melbourne and Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, as well as Associate Professor Anna Hallerhoff from Deakin University, who we are very lucky to have as a consultant on the project. The key representatives assisted in recruiting a paid outreach worker from the temple. So we allocated some of our budget to actually paying outreach workers to be a contact point for any person seeking assistance relating to family violence within the temple. So as others have talked about, we know that when we start discussing family violence in community settings that there will be disclosures. People might realise for the first time that what they're experiencing at home is actually family violence, or people may feel like they're safe to tell someone now, now the topic is being discussed openly. So it was important for us to establish the outreach worker roles as well as resources for referring to support services really early on as a priority. And embedding these roles in each community was critical for us because they needed to speak the community language. So just last week, we actually had a woman disclose a very serious situation to the outreach worker, and the worker was able to talk to her in her language and then reach out to me and debrief with me. So our strategy for rolling out the project in each temple has obviously been impacted by COVID restrictions like everyone else. We were still very much building relationships with these temples and unpacking what the project might look like for each temple when Victoria went into lockdown. And it was difficult to progress this in an online environment, so we had to adapt and change our plans a little bit. We had planned to hold individual women's feedback groups in each temple, which was really ideal because each temple is very different in terms of their language, tradition, and culture. But it was very difficult to organise this remotely, especially when we needed an interpreter. So instead, we held an online group with the outreach workers that we had already recruited from the pilot projects and a group of female Buddhist leaders from a variety of temples beyond the pilot temples. And now this group will consult on various resources for the project and provide advice on project activities, although we're still really hoping to be able to set up the feedback groups in each temple, and I know that one of them is progressing remotely. So to raise awareness of the project in lockdown, for members of the pilot temple as well as the broader Buddhist community, we held an online event earlier this month. So being online, we were able to record that, and I've noticed that it's a lot more accessible in some ways because a lot more people can view the recording or attend, across Victoria. So that's a silver lining. At the event, we announced training for faith leaders to prevent and respond to family violence, and we launched a family violence hub card with information on identifying family violence, warning signs, information on intervention orders, the police, and support services for women, men, and children. And we've translated these into the languages of the pilot temples. They're available on the Buddhist Council of Victoria website. And we do still plan to produce booklets with more information about family violence, as well as guidelines for promoting gender equality, managing disclosures, and posters and a video. So the training, we're holding it in early 2021 in January and February, and we've developed a pre-training survey to understand the existing knowledge, attitudes and beliefs of the community. And this data will inform the resources that I've mentioned. And at the end of the project, we'll circulate the same survey so we can measure the impact the project has had.
So first of all, congratulations for that online launch event. I saw the recording, so yes, silver lining. So just like another question comes to my mind is that, Buddhist tradition, in Buddhist tradition, monks are more likely to be monastic. So does this change the approach of your project compared to the other projects that we have just listened to?
At the beginning of the project, we queried if it should just be the monastics involved in the project, as the wording around the Royal Commission recommendation relating to the project seemed to suggest that. However, we were really encouraged to include lay leaders, as the scope of the project would be very limited if we only engaged ordained leaders who often, as you've said, live a monastic lifestyle and have limited interaction with the community. So our focus is also on community lay leaders who are more likely to get involved in the operational side of family violence prevention and response. Having said that, we have some incredible monastics who are really enthusiastic about being involved in the project too.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. Yeah, so again, like as I have been asking the other panelists as well, so what are some of the challenges that you are facing in the project?
Yeah, the COVID restrictions were definitely the biggest challenge. So our project was suspended early in the year because we really preferred to deliver our training programs face-to-face. But working remotely, we have been able to produce materials, work on modifying the training content, hold an online event, and work with the female leadership group to develop future strategies when places of worship open up, as they are doing, which is great. Another challenge has been with so many nationalities as part of Buddhism, there is a challenge around accessibility, in particular choosing which languages to translate resources to, as well as tailoring content to be relevant to particular cultures and cultural practices. So it's not a one size fits all approach. And yeah, like others have talked about, it's almost like 3 separate projects. Another challenge has been around the prevention side of the project. So most Buddhist people agree that violence against women is wrong and they want to know how to respond appropriately to victims, but they don't necessarily make the link between gender inequality and violence against women. And so there's sometimes a tension between the framework behind the project's evidence guide and the technical paper and the understandings and beliefs of the faith community. And we encountered some issues with engagement to do with the capacity of faith leaders. But something I also wanted to note as well is the sensitivity of this particular topic and how that impacts engagement. Some people I personally spoke to didn't want to participate in the project activities, and I later discovered they had been directly affected by family violence themselves. Family violence is so prevalent that we just need to be mindful that if we aren't getting that engagement, it might not be because someone is opposed to the initiative. It may be that the topic is challenging for them personally.
Yeah, very true. And also, I know for Buddhist project, this is just the beginning, but do you see any achievements or any successes that you feel happy about or are really proud of achieving during all this COVID craziness?
Yeah, definitely. So we work closely with the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health to adapt their training package to make it appropriate and relevant for the Buddhist context. So the training now includes a presentation on gender and Buddhism, which Anna Halifoff has delivered and will develop. Developed and will deliver. So this is the first training of its kind that I'm aware of specifically for Buddhist leaders. So that's really exciting. The female Buddhist leaders group that we did hold online was also a key success. Bringing together senior female leaders from across Victoria was such a privilege, and having their input on the project is just invaluable. We've also consulted with Buddhist monks and nuns in other parts of Australia who have played a key role in promoting gender equality in Buddhism. The project is also receiving interest from other places of worship, organisations and institutions in Victoria, Australia and internationally, including the World Fellowship on Buddhist Standing Committee on Women. So it's great to see the learnings and materials having that reach. As I mentioned, we recently had an online launch event and we were really honoured to have guest speakers, including the Minister for Prevention of Family Violence, Gabrielle Williams, and the Chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, Vivian Nguyen, as well as 2 Buddhist monastics promoting the project. A highlight for me has also been getting to know the other project officers and sharing learnings and providing that peer support. And I think communities of practice are really important, especially for prevention practitioners. Often we have standalone roles, we're not part of a team. So that peer support is really, really lovely. And I've really loved participating in the faith community of practice that Monisha has facilitated. And I also attend a DVRCV community of practice for prevention practitioners, which is fabulous. And I also want to say the Monisha and the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health have been really wonderful partners and supporters, and I've learned so much from and always answering my emails, as well as Cathy, Vaughan and the University of Melbourne, who have been very encouraging and extremely generous with their time on the project.
Wow, thanks, Jess, for all the kind words. Thank you. I really appreciate that, you really enjoy the community of practice. So thanks for that. So how do you see the future of your project?
Well, as others have said, it's a pilot project. So we've really only just touched on 3 Buddhist places of worship. Building engagement with faith communities with culturally and linguistically diverse cohorts really takes time and investment. And there are so many more Buddhist places of worship that we can influence if this project does continue in the future. So it's really important to secure future funding to build on this work and to keep the momentum going.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess it's really really encouraging to see that how Buddhist Council Victoria is really giving their all efforts, putting their all efforts to engage as many temples as they can, and you are going to be a trendsetter and a trailblazer. So congratulations on that. And with that, I guess we now have time for question answer. So anybody would like to ask any questions to our panelists, please, that's your time now.
Monisha, I might just respond to a couple of questions that have come in while the presentations have been going on, if that's okay. So first of all, so great to hear about the progress of all of these projects. It's fantastic to be involved in, and I always thought these projects were incredibly ambitious being done on a shoestring, and now you've done it on a shoestring in a pandemic. So I think you should all be incredibly proud of yourselves. It's fantastic work. The 2 questions that were sent through to me, there was one that's come from Francis Prince from the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, which was asking about when you're talking about the evidence and that evidence review that we did, and the fact that there was limited evidence, are we just talking about Australia or are we talking about internationally? And that the review was actually an international review. We looked at literature that was my linguistic capacity is limited, and I really only speak Tok Pisin, which is a Papua New Guinean language, other than Australia, and there's not a lot of literature published in Pisin. So we were limited to focusing on English language resources, which is a limitation of that review, but it was international. The largest, I guess the country that's produced the most evidence from faith settings and work with faith leaders would be the United States, probably followed by Australia actually, and then Israel, UK, Canada also have quite bodies of work. But as I was saying, it is largely from Christian, Muslim and Jewish communities, and far less has been published from the very many other faiths that are important to the Victorian community. So that's the response to that question. And actually just one more point on that question is that actually some of the best evidence that's coming out about prevention and response work in faith settings and with faith leaders is actually coming from low and middle income countries at the moment. So there's been really good work come out of Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Brazil. There's some literature that's coming, usually funded by international donors and being conducted with faith communities in less resource rich countries. And so I'm definitely very interested in that work, but what is less clear is sometimes the applicability of some of the lessons given the very different roles that faith leaders can play in diverse settings around the world. And the second question that's come through is around the potential for this was from Philippa at the Multi-Faith South Australia, about the potential for interfaith work and what the evidence says around interfaith work. Basically, there is a lot of potential for interfaith work around joint statements, around raising awareness of the importance of the issue across all of our communities, that this is not something that affects any one particular faith tradition more than others, that this is something that all faith communities have a responsibility to be mindful of and respond to. And there is some potential for local joint support for responses. So whether that's around referral of women, everyone understanding where local services are in a local setting. Where it's less evidence that it's effective is around interfaith work for prevention. Because prevention really does involve looking at your kind of, I guess, own house around gender and the position of men and women in your community and what your faith teaches around the role of men and women and families, in families. There's a lot of potential, I guess, for misunderstandings across faith traditions when doing interfaith work on that. And that's where probably an intra-faith approach is more appropriate. So I think there's definitely a place for interfaith work, but for prevention-oriented work, probably within a faith tradition is going to be more effective. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to ask a question, if I might. My name's Lawrence Gray. I work with the Wyndham Community Education Centre. I support the Wyndham Interfaith Network, along with Bakhtar, and we have some other members on this call as well. We have 7 different major faiths involved. We've worked on campaigns in partnership with the 3 other interfaith groups in the West and other partners such as Hobson's Bay Council and IPC Health on respectful relationships. What I'd like to understand, because you touched on it, I think it was Jessica from working with the Buddhist community, certainly working with cold communities, I'm very interested to understand if the resources that you've described would be available as a framework, and also what sort of support may be available to help communities contextualize that into their own situation, and taking into account some of the cultural attitudes and behaviours that are also party to that for people who are coming from different traditions. And just if you can give some advice about possible resource sources that might be available, and also whether or not there is some opportunity for either Multicultural Commission or Faith Community Council Victoria to approach other peak bodies to see if some of this can be advanced in different areas. I'm very encouraged by what has been shared today, but thank you for that. If you can shed some light on that, thanks.
Thanks, Lawrence. I'll attempt to answer some of that. So in terms of resources that we're producing, what we have available at the moment is more of the tertiary end. So responding to disclosures and referring to support services and that sort of thing. We are going to be producing resources that are more around supporting faith leaders to engage in activities that promote gender equality, but we haven't been able to start those yet. They will be really focused on the Vietnamese and Chinese communities because those are the pilot temples that we're working with. And in relation to further resources, I think Sandy will know more about this, but the Faith Safe website have some really good resources.
I think Sandy might want to take that one.
Yeah, please.
Yes, I'm just trying to spotlight myself, but I don't think I can. Can someone else spotlight me? Lawrence, we are developing a website. It's called faithsafe.org.au, and on that website we're accumulating all the information that has come from all the different faith traditions. You can actually go online now and you can see some of that work. It's not completed yet. So a lot of the information that's come out of this PAR project is being documented on that website. And we are going through all the peak bodies and asking them to add whatever material they currently have developed on prevention of family violence to that website. So it's work in progress, and we hope in about 6 months' time that website will be ready, and we'll let you know when we launch it. We'll invite you to the launch. I'll pass you back. The next question I think was asked from Jaswinder Singh. So if I can just bring him online and he can ask the next question.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks a lot. My name is Jaswinder Singh, and I'm working as a community engagement worker with Sikh Australian Support for Family Violence organization. This is a 5-year-old organization working continuously with the Sikh community to spread information and empower the community in relations to family violence, mental health, and related kind of activities of violence is happening. My question is, I'm not sure whom I shall direct it to, but I will ask to Monisha here, that in this whole project, who's actually representing Sikh community, and what are the institutions, which institutions, Sikh institutions are being involved? And because I think the time is very limited, so I'll put my next question as well. When we say that we are trying to empower and train faith leaders to, and we're trying to facilitate them to address these issues, are we saying that we are providing them training to these particular pilot institutes and empowering them to keep on this work for a longer period of time, or is it like that they will keep on doing these things till the funding is there, and once that is stopped, they will stop the work as well? So I just want to need both of these. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaswinder, for your question. Maybe I'll address the first question. So for the Sikh community, the pilot project is being run by Victorian Sikh Gurdwara Council, and they are doing it further in partnership with Women's Health in Southeast WISE, and also Kulturbrille. So maybe Anu can also jump in. And so they are doing it with, I guess, 5 Sikh temples and their communities. So that is in the city of Greater Dandenong, Windham City Council, then city of Whitehorse, Great Shepparton City Council, and Hume City Council. So these are the 5 areas where the Sikh temples are being worked with. And yeah, so that's how the Sikh community is being involved. And for the second part, maybe Anu, because she's also part of the Sikh community project, so maybe if Anu would like to address that section.
Thank you, Monisha, and thank you, Jaswinder, for the question. And we didn't have Lucy to present on the work done with the Victorian Sikh Gurdwara Council today, but the project has had a fantastic run so far in engaging with the community, running a number of focus groups to find out what the issues were. And I'm coming on board now to develop training material, like you said, for the faith leaders and the community members in general. So it's not going to be just training, one-time training for the community, but developing a train the trainer module. So it is something that can be taken on further after the project exits, because the funding, I think, is up until the middle of next year, and then the project comes to an end. But we didn't want to leave all the valuable learnings that we've had and just let it go. So we do have the capacity now to build some trainer material, which we are going to be delivering to community leaders and others who'd like to become the trainers for the next set of people and do in-community training in language, which is where a major gap, I think, is for all the projects, is that it's great for us to bring the resources as experts, but until it's able to be delivered in language, and I speak particularly for the Hindu community, the Sikh community, and the Buddhist community, where language is a massive issue, we need to make sure that we are giving the community leaders the in-language training and skills that they need so they can take the message forward. So that's happening. Yes.
So thanks for this insight, Anu and Monisha. Just because you guys are doing such an amazing job, and I'm really delighted to hear about all of these things. It is only today that I come across all of this information. I was like living in the dark before this, because I now know that you are going to do such kind of, you're going to produce such kind of material in terms of translation to Punjabi language. If you need any help, I'm more than happy to help as a volunteer. Thank you.
I think Lucy will be very happy to hear that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
fantastic. Thank you, Jaswinder. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have one. Hello, I'm Terry Sussmilch. I convene the Faith Communities Network of Tasmania, and I'm part of Religions for Peace Australia. I'm also a survivor of family violence, which not only lost me my marriage, but lost me my faith. So I cannot congratulate you more on the work you're doing and the enormous tidal wave of stuff to get through in this area. I'm delighted to see it's happening from within academia because we know it's evidence-based. I'm interested in faith leaders in particular because I was connected with another project which also happened in Melbourne, and a faith leader who took his training very seriously and started talking about family conflict from in his sermons and supporting the women who disclosed, and was the victim of threats from their husbands. And just interested to know whether there might be any follow-up from the training of the faith leaders to see what consequences there may have been and what support there is for them if they do take this big step, because it is a big step for some in some communities.
Perhaps I might respond to that first, Terry, and then Robyn, I might ask you if you want to respond to the last little bit about follow-up as well. First of all, Terry, thank you for sharing that. And actually, it was lovely hearing you calling in from Tasmania. You've got beautiful bird song in the background there. So that was very, very nice to hear coming all the way from Tasmania. And thanks for your personal courage in sharing how this is relevant to your experience. You're absolutely right that when we did the literature review around the evidence around working with faith leaders, that one of the challenges that they commonly report is that often a woman experiencing violence, but also the person using violence against them are both members of their congregation. And so that can put faith leaders in a very difficult position. They'll often have a relationship with both parties and need to maintain a relationship with both parties, but it also can they can physically be fearful for themselves if a perpetrator of violence is particularly threatening. So that is in the literature, it's in the evidence as a barrier to faith leaders kind of becoming more involved in this area. So you're quite right there. In terms of follow-up, I will hand to Robyn in a moment, but certainly, and I'd say that the work, partly because they had Robyn all ready to go when the project started. The work in the Anglican Diocese has been really moving at great speed, even throughout the COVID period, and is now at the stage where there is follow-up going on, and we're currently evaluating with the Anglican Diocese the wider program of work that they're doing, and talking to faith leaders many months down the track about their experience. Of course, it's tricky with violence because it's not like they're going to receive disclosures every week or every month. This comes up at intervals over a period of time. And so you really need a very long-term evaluation to assess that sort of impact. But Robyn, do you want to maybe speak about the follow-up work and the kind of, I guess, coaching and support you provide on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, so thank you again for your question. That's a really, really good question. So I suppose part of what we do is to, when we're equipping church leaders, to really emphasise the point that they're not the professionals and that we have great professionals available for support, and to point them to where that is available in terms of if they need to debrief, where they can speak to family violence professionals about if they're starting to get resistance to the message, etc. We also have a professional standards organisation for the diocese called Kulturbrille, and that's been set up initially in response to the child safety, but it also covers family violence. So it's also a number that and an organisation that priests can go to if they need to debrief and talk through these things. And that organisation can also put in place certain processes and facilitate processes where such things are happening in a faith community. And in that organisation, there's people who have a background of working in CASAs, in professional family violence services. So there's a lot of expertise there to try and help support church leaders to navigate some of those complexities. I think part of the challenge is that our programme, like the others, it's just based on short-term funding. So at the moment, we're facing the programme in its current form. Unless we secure more funding, will run out in a few months. And so that is a challenge for exactly what you've raised. What about that? Because I do find that priests also phone me up, although we point them to these other support options. I think it's that thing of that relational person they know, they've met in the training, and even though I'm effectively signposting them onto the professional services, they seem to appreciate that middle support. So yeah, I think it's a good point that needs to be thought more about and built on.
I think the next question is from me. So I'm Yvette Barnes. Can everybody hear me? Thumbs up. Yep, there's a nod. Okay, I'm the Secretary of the Melton Interfaith Network, and I'm also the Director of Communications for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the Wyndham area. My question, I've got a couple actually. The first question is really about feedback from those people who've been participating in these projects. What sort of feedback have you had, both negative and positive? So it was really when you were speaking, Anu, that I was first thinking about this. So what sort of feedback have you had from the participants who've been doing these projects? Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette, for asking the question. And I can tell you I had both extremely negative and extremely positive feedback. I think always nice to start with the positive first. I think the positive feedback was that from the younger people, that everything resonated. The language resonated, and many of these children are attending spiritual classes as well. And we were able to relate that to things that they'd heard in the scriptures in the form of examples. And the Hindu religion gives us a lot of opportunities to have quite robust discussions around the role of men and women in our literature and mythology, and also the strong focus on female deities. And how is it that we're talking about respect and equity when we're worshipping female deities? Why doesn't it translate? Because there is strong evidence of patriarchal pressures and lots of different forms of violence that are evident even through our scriptures and currently in society. So we had very positive feedback from the young people that we were discussing this openly. And the same thing translated in the parents, who are effectively not the direct parents, but the parent group, the older ones, saying that you can't be talking about all of this stuff in this way. We don't want the children to lose respect for some of our concepts. And can we tone down the language a little bit? It's cultural, and therefore people don't really understand where some of that is coming from. Respect is embedded in everything that we do. And I think while that was the negative feedback that happened and caused some disengagement in probably going further in the work with a couple of the groups, but the positive that came out of that negative feedback is that we were then able to literally unpick and unpack, peel the onion literally, in talking about, it's great to talk about the values of respect and equity, but how is that influencing or translating into attitudes, behaviors, and actions within the faith communities, and how is the younger generation actually seeing those values being played out. And that led to some deeper conversations, particularly with the ISKCON group of women and men who were, I think for them, it was the first time it had been discussed in those terms, and that made sense. And I think as people, we like to be given solutions, not problems. And when you start people thinking about what the solution might look like, the engagement becomes a little bit richer. So that was good.
Thank you. That's brilliant. I also have a question for all of you about what sort of work is being done currently with perpetrators, because that's the flip side of this, which information is really important. Changing community views is really important. Helping leaders learn how to support people who have been violent. But unless there's support for people who are violent in retraining their behaviours, the problem in some ways will continue with those people that are currently violent. So what work is being done in that space? And so Robyn, to you first.
Yeah. I think not a lot. As Cathy kind of found her research, I mean, Cathy, you'll speak better to this, but in terms of in our setting, not a lot. There's not a lot of good understanding. I think priests do want to understand this and do a good job. They really care, and in the Christian faith, which is a real strength, but also a weakness in this area, is our beliefs around forgiveness and redemption and everything. So we do believe in the full humanity and hope in perpetrators, but that has to be with great caution. But yeah, there's not a lot of knowledge, and it's an area that we need to expand on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cathy?
Yeah. There is very little work that's faith specific that's gone on with men who use violence. So in Victoria, generally, there's not enough programs specifically with men who use violence, and there's waiting lists that are quite long in some instances. In Touch have certainly done work with a number of organisations about trying to have language specific groups, but they're not faith specific. So there might be an Arabic language. Now, many of those men may be Muslims, but many of them will be Christian as well. So it's not faith specific. And a number of the communities that we've spoken to have highlighted the difficulty when, and in my other research with migrant and refugee communities, where we've talked with women and talked with men who've used violence. If a man, and I'm specifically speaking about migrant and refugee communities here, is mandated through a court order, for example, to go to a behaviour change program, but because of their faith, and the program doesn't engage with their faith, there can be complete dismissal of what's being said, because it's not speaking to the very deep-seated belief system about their rights as a man or their role in the family as a man. And so I think there's a huge need here and a huge opportunity, but to my knowledge, there's very little going on that's faith-specific. Language, yes. Region of origin, yes, but not specific to faith. In the the US, there's been a little bit of work in specific faith communities around perpetrators, but not strong evaluation. So it's difficult to assess the effectiveness of those interventions.
Yeah, thank you. What about in Anu?
Like Cathy said, I think in Victoria, in Australia particularly, I think there is very little. There is very little work going on within faith communities. Now, I am familiar with the In Touch Motivation for Change program, because I'm one of the trilingual facilitators for the program. I run the sessions on Saturday for different language groups. For example, in the Hindi and Punjabi language groups, many of the men are from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, but they come from different faith groups. So we've got Christian, Hindu, and Sikh men in there. And it's impossible for us to address the language part enough and the cultural aspects, which are quite similar across the subcontinent, but impossible for us to bring the faith element in as well. The other issue with bringing the faith element in is reflected in what Cathy said earlier. There is an inherent reluctance of mainstream services to engage with faith, because a lot of the faith traditions deeply are rooted in gender inequality, or many of the practices are rooted in gender inequality. And it becomes almost impossible as a secular organization to then give any oxygen to that conversation to happen. But I completely agree with Cathy. If you are in faith, then it's an inherent part of who you are. And the minute you hear but after something, you're going to disengage. So it's definitely a big gap. And hopefully we've got enough voices here to talk about funding some of that work.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank you, Sandhu. I was just going to share an example that may be helpful. I asked for permission to say this. I'm also from a faith community, the Baha'i community in Whitehorse, and an experience I've had with the community was that part of being part of that community group, the members of the community were also encouraged to see themselves as members of society also, that the services out there can apply and can be supportive. And in trying to bridge that gap, the main body in the community wrote a letter of support with the beliefs, the general beliefs of the members of the community. And so if anyone needed to see a psychologist, see a behavioral support in any way for any age group of any sort, then that sort of gave them confidence to be able to reach out, and they were connected. So that may be something that might be helpful to other communities.
Right, thank you.
So I guess that was the last comment from Donia. Thank you, Donia, for that. Thank you everyone for all your very relevant questions and inputs. It's been a great discussion. So I think I'll just quickly wrap up that, listening to all the panelists and the entire discussion, some key points clearly emerge that I would again like to reiterate. Faith-based settings definitely have a lot of scope and potential to address violence against women, specifically family violence. Religious organizations have sensitive nuances, particularly around theological beliefs and cultural norms. And therefore, any prevention organization that intends to work with the faith communities must acknowledge and be sensitive to these beliefs and norms, and then forge partnerships with patience and perseverance. Since there is huge diversity that we have all seen in heard in all the projects, diversity even within not just different religions, but even within the religion itself. So one approach may not fit all. That's very clearly evident. Therefore, it's really important to be mindful of using appropriate language and appropriate resources that are acceptable to the leaders as well as to their congregations. Next, look for leaders or champions within the faith communities. Someone who may not necessarily be a priest because they are already pressed for time, but those individuals who are empowered and sensitive about the issue, involving women, making their groups, taking their feedback, focusing on youth, making their youth groups. That's another approach that has really come out very well. And last but not least, what everybody again has shared is funding. So multicultural communities depend heavily on volunteers. So external professional assistance is much needed and appreciated. While some Christian churches are able to provide some internal funding for this work, most of it, like not all multicultural communities are have that kind of a support, and they're largely at the mercy of external funding. So as all of you have said that this project has simply scratched the surface and there's still a lot to be done. So considering that the faith sector represents a large percentage of society, there is great potential for faith communities to assist in the prevention and response of family violence and violence against women. So this brings us to the end of today's webinar. I would once again like to thank all the panelists for sharing their valuable work with all of us. I would also like to thank Faith Communities Council of Victoria for organizing the webinar. And most importantly, my heartfelt thanks to our lovely audience for attending the discussion, staying beyond 3:30 p.m. our slotted time, and also supporting this very important work. So thank you all for your attendance, and have a lovely rest of the evening. Thank you.